Hello and welcome. My name is Anita Kvamme and I'm working at Equinor, a huge energy company with more than 20,000 employees. And that's a good place to be because we're allowed to do DDD. Wow. However, I'm really glad to see you here, and I am having a talk today called Modeling the Domain Model with the User's Mental Model in mind. And this talk has a story behind. You see, when I was on the age of my oldest daughter and I should decide what should I be now when I grow up, I said, okay, I want to be a psychologist. Or no, maybe I want to be a coder. So I started to study psychology for a year. But in Norway at that time, it was 3 years waiting time to get into the professional study to become a psychologist. So I started in the Norwegian technical high school to study software engineering so I can be a coder. And there I learned about an area called usability. And I was thinking, yeah, that's for me. I can code, but I still can have this human dimension. That's great. But then I was a bit disappointed because my professors didn't teach us much about this area. So I approached one of them, taking the cover. I said, you should learn us more about usability. And there is a theories from psychology that we can use. And he looked at me, and he didn't smile, and he said, psychologists, they study insane people. We can't use anything from them. Anyway, I graduated as a software engineer, but with a passion for usability. And focusing on usability, I learned early about a model that states that if you're able to communicate the functionality in your user interface through a design model that is not far away from the user's mental model, you are more likely to get a usable solution. And this model is from the famous book of Dan Norman called The Psychology of Everything or The Design of Everything. It's the same book. So the user mental model is what the user believes about something. So for a business solution, it was the think about their domain they're working in, but also for what they think about kind of similar solution. And the user used this model unconsciously to predict the system behavior. So they use it when they use the solution you make. And of course, there is a designer that has its designer model that is kind of the basis for the user interface it design. And this is the gap between those models. And I was new in this area, and I didn't know much about the business. I was thinking, if I should manage to make usable solution, I need help, because my designer model in my head is not close enough to the user's mental model. So I started to make explicit models. I was discussing with our expert user, and when I say expert user, that's also the domain expert. And I said, okay, I think something like this. Is that how you are thinking? And I said, no, it's not completely like that. You have to change something. And then we cooperate to make a better model. And I discussed with my team, and I said, listen, this concept, where on earth in our user's head should it fit? And sometimes they told me, oh, you should hide it from the users. It doesn't make meaning for them. And we said, okay. But does it make meaning then if it's not any meaningful for our user? And sometimes we remove it all the way from the technical design. So for me, I see great similarities between doing this and doing DDD, even though our focus is a bit different. When we are doing DDD, as you all know, we make this model to exploit it in code to solve our problems easy. Where we, in the user interface area, has this designer model, mental model gap we want to make. But anyway, chasing this ultimate designer model, that was my door into modeling. And I've done more modeling after that. So today I will share a story with you. I will share about the modeling we did in a legacy application called Energy Boss. The first line of code was written back in 1993. So even when this project started, that lasted for about 3 years, it was kind of 20 years of code that has been constantly growing. But luckily, there was a project that said part of the solution, due to a technical risk assessment, we need to break it up in more modular solution and rewrite it in C#. We cannot have the old technology anymore. And the project is finished now, and I am in the DevOps team, and I think this promised land of DDD is a really good place to be. So today I will try to share a lot of reflections, because I don't think it's too often that you are able to be on a project lasting for years in a domain area. I've been working for years and years, so I knew quite a bit of the domain when this project started. So I tried to reflect, and some of these learnings I will share with you today, but I will also share how we worked, because I think that was really important for how we did our modeling. And we had a team that was really, a lot of us has been working in this area for years and years, so it's a fun area to work in. And because of that, we had this business competence. Just say, on a really high level, this energy boss solution has two parts. One is the invoicing part, and then it's related to invoicing our gas sales agreement and gas power agreement and related cost agreements. And then you have the financial services part, and that is where the project is, so that it will be the focus for the rest of this talk. Yeah, so of course, I said we had a lot of competence, but of course we don't believe in not speaking to our real expert, meaning the people working in the business. One of the BAs on the IT side has also some accounting competence, so he was really expert user in a way, but we had this meeting with our business expert, meaning the expert user of our solution, and we were discussing, because we needed to know for this new solution, or for the old solution, what are working well, what should be enhanced. I said it was a rewrite, but you never just rewrite without thinking and trying to make something better you can give your users. And it's the part they didn't use, we could throw that away and put the effort into enhancing something else instead. So this discussion was important. And the first bonded context, because I will just focus on the domain modeling we did inside the bonded context and not how they play together, was related to something special. So I need to explain a bit about the business. You see, in Norway, the government actually owns part of the oil and gas fields. So when we are producing gas, the government owns part of that, but they have other things to do than chasing customers and knowing all the details in the agreement and making invoices and all that stuff. So Equinor has this special and important role to make sure that the government gets its part. So it handles the gas on behalf of the government. And this is called the state direct financial interest. I will just call it the state. So I will talk about Equinor and the state. So, meaning that when we are sending an invoice to the customer, part of the gas we are selling belongs to the government or the state. So we need to split it. The financial service part has the responsibility to make sure that the state gets its part and Equinor gets its part about the cost and the income. And there is a lot of ways to split this, a lot of rules, but the beauty of DDD is that we can always rely on what are we focusing on now, and this bonded context, only responsibility is actually to make this production split. And there is different type of these splits, but the most common one is a configuration of a set of a field, and you can look upon the result just as a pie chart. It's a percentage to the state, a percentage to Equinor. And I picked this one because it's a very easy one. And I think an easy bonded context is a good place to start telling you how we worked. So the first thing we need to do every time is, of course, to understand the problem. So we used to discuss that, and when we have a view of what should we solve, we always gather all the people, sometimes we were two teams, in one room, and we discussed, okay, should it be a new bonded context? And when we knew, in this case, we wanted a new one, we identified a service, and we made a figure like this. We actually draw this circle. We said, okay, this is a calculation. We need to know the information needs. And some of the information that was needed might owned by this bonded context, shown by the database symbol, and some are owned by other bonded contexts. So then we saw a bit about the boundaries, always focus on the boundaries. And then, of course, we said, okay, what is the result of this calculation? What should that be? And in this case, it's the production split. The diagram was a bit more complicated than this, but not much, and it was a good tool for us to communicate in the team, and that's why I'm showing you it here. We also set up, okay, what is the aggregate here? Just to have an early view on the aggregates. And for this one, that was very easy. We also said something about the calculation rule, so we could all be on board of what we, on a high level, what we were making. This might sound like a bit of a data-driven approach, but it didn't feel that way. And believe me, I know what a data-driven approach is, because in our old tool, it was incredibly tightly linked to the database. We couldn't write code until we had the entities, the attribute, and the relationship in the database, because that was how the tool worked. So here we only focus on the naming the aggregates. We don't are focusing on the attributes or the details inside the aggregates. And then we used BDD, behavior-driven design, and that is, I guess most of you know it, but I will just take a short introduction. It's all about having these good examples, knowing that given this or this, when that happens, and when for us is typical the service then this or this should happen. So it's all about having these examples. And the founder of Cucumber, a well-known BDD tool, said in a talk at DDD Exchange for some years ago that he used the term discovering the domain when he worked this way. And I think that felt quite the same for us. So every example makes it possible to pick kind of a new requirement. So you get all the requirement on board, and we also use that actually to form our aggregates. And we called it feature test instead of BDD, but it is the same. And gradually is really important here. What we did was that we started with the really simple examples first. We had done specification by examples before, but when we did that, we always put in all the details. It was a specification, so we needed kind of have the whole truth in one. So here we focus, and this is something like it could be given an NCS, as it stands for Norwegian Continental Shelf, split type configuration, and that configuration has two fields. When you calculate the production split, well, then you get a production split. It isn't a lot of information there, but it still was our starting point for shaping our domain model, because we focus on using the language in our feature test, the language from the business domain, and then that part will kind of automatically feed into the domain model. So the feature test and the namings there was really important. Okay. And then we put more information into the test. We gradually added more and more. And that, again, made our domain model to gradually evolve. And we didn't try to have this perfect model from the start. We believe in refactoring the domain model. We actually don't do the typical unit test, because we only have each of these feature tests is our automatically test support. And that makes it really easy to refactor inside a mono context. And we use C# that have good support for extracting methods and changing stuff. So that makes it also easy. So we just started and we're really good at doing the refactoring part. So this was how we discovered our domain. And for an easy bonnet context like this, we more or less could just have the concept that we saw from the feature test, and that was all the concept that we had in our domain model too. But not all bonnet contexts are like that. I will show you later. So if we go back and think about the user's mentor model, I think this was an easy bonnet context, partly because it was so easy to understand how the user was thinking about the domain. The production on the gas and oil field is really, that is physical. The production split is easy to discuss around and reason about, so it's quite easy to do this. But I have to say one thing. I don't believe in copying the user mental model. That is not what I'm talking about. It's just that our domain model makes sense for our users. And of course, there is nothing like the user mental model. Each user has its own mental model. But if they work in the same business area, they are likely to have some part of how they are thinking that are similar. And when I think about, because a domain model is not enough that it reflects how the users are thinking and their language, it also has to be useful. And when I think about all the strange things I have in my head, I don't believe that copying a user mental model, if that's had been possible, would ever give you a useful model. It would have been too much details. But anyway, do anyone see one wrong thing here? I'm speaking at a D conference. What doesn't add up? I made it easy, in yellow. It's simple rules. We don't do DDD for simple stuff, do we? We hear that all the time. But actually, Steve Lowe at the DDD Explore conference, he said he believed that the hard stuff just needed DDD more. I've heard people say, you can do DDD for simple stuff, it's just much more boring. But there is another view on this too. And Eric Evans said that at the Explore in his keynote before Christmas, that we need to practice more. And we were a team where we had this wonderful team lead, Ellen Lippe, which really was clever in doing this, but the rest of us, we needed to learn. So doing DDD for this simple bonded context, well, it made it possible to explain you how we work, but it was mainly because it made us possible to understand how we use those feature tests and drive a good domain and useful domain model based on that. Okay, then I will go on to the next bonded context. And one thing is that you should never start with thinking about a user model first. You always have, of course, to start with thinking about the problem to solve. And that is especially important for us working with a legacy solution, because we can be honest to say that how the user are working is kind of influenced by, or the honest part is more dictated by, how the legacy solution work in a lot of settings. And that was what we experienced in our next bonded context. And that is related to this Equinor state split, actually splitting the invoice in two. And the old solution was like, okay, if you have an invoice and the production split was ready, the users had to know about this and figure out this. And that was different user from them that made this invoice. So you have this invoice from you sent to a customer, and then a user push a button in the old solution, and it made something that is called an SDFI invoice. So it's kind of two invoices. And we had figured out that, okay, this is an invoiced SDFI invoice, so you can reverse it and you can adjust it and do a lot of things here while the invoice you sent to a user was still not have been changed. So that was a bit hard to follow, and a lot of strange things happens. And also, if you have a new invoice you send to the customer, or you get a new version of the production split, the user always have to be on top and know that, oh, I have to push that button to make this SDFI invoice. So we discussed with our user, and we figured out we needed to do simplifications here, because we truly had this situation where it was the legacy code that made the mental model, and we wouldn't like to mimic that. So we said, what is actually are we trying to solve? And what we are trying to do is just to split this invoice so we have something to send to do the accounting correct. And I've explained the voucher part later on. But that was really the whole problem. So we started out with discussion with the users, drawing things, looking at alternative ways to look at this. And then we figured out a concept that we called Equinor state split. And those discussions was important input to making the domain model. So we used that when we set up our feature tests. But when it comes to, we want it to be automatically, but when it comes to when should it be triggered automatically, the user way of thinking was our best source of information. So we used that to set up our feature test. And of course, what we wanted to do and what we wanted that should happen was that based on these discussions and based on working with a new solution, time after time we hoped that this new Equinor state split concept should be visible and an important part of how the user were thinking. And when it comes to the aggregate which we produced based on this calculation of this Equinor state split, we ended up with a list of kind of split lines. And what I see in retrospect is that even though we in our domain model have possibility to group them based on the original invoice we sent to users, and now to the customer, sorry, that is not really visible in our domain model. And talking to the users, I have understood that it's much more important for them. So what happened here was actually that since we did not have their language, we had invented kind of new concept together with our users. So we didn't have their language as guide us. When we did the feature test, we got a domain model that had what I call a bit of a technical touch. However, I think we should have seen this in our feature test and corrected it there. But unfortunately, we didn't do that. Anyway, last week, actually, we got an email from one of the users saying that this functionality works so much better than the old solution. So I think we need to live with this a bit of language confusion, or we are needed to put more effort into it. But what I really learned from working with this bonnet contact was how happy we were in most of our other bonnet contacts, because we kind of spoke the business language quite fluently, since we have been working with our users for many, many years, a lot of the people in the team. So if you are doing this approach, I think you need to invest quite a bit in understanding the business if you don't have that understanding in your team from before. Yeah. So in this bonnet context, it was much harder for us to actually think about the user's mental model because it wasn't there. And I think the new concept of Equinor state split has been easier to kind of make a part of the language if you haven't had an old concept. So always when you try to make new solution based on solving old problems, for us, the SDFI invoice, in a way, I think it was there, and it made the new concept not so easy for that one to shine. So that's something to have in mind. And then I will go to the accounting bonnet context. And the accounting bonnet context, in a way, it's a bit funny to even talk about accounting in a DDD conference, because you heard that that is not typical of DDD stuff. But for Equinor, we have SAP as our central accounting solution, so it isn't the standard accounting processes we are talking about here. The accounting bonnet context has some functionality that was really important for the users for years and years before we did this rewrite, and it was really clear that this must be part of the new solution too. And what it does is to make them set up what we call an accounting template, and that is a way of configuring how should this be accounted, what companies in SAP, because Equinor as a huge company how different, for instance, the daughter company in UK has its own accounting books. So you have to be able to configure what company should it be, what accounts, what profit center, and a lot of stuff. And since our solution has made the users able to set up this template, and you can take an invoice and you take that template, and then you have a decent set of hard-coded rules, and you can calculate what we call a voucher, and I will come back to what a voucher is. But the point is that the user can do this without involving IT, and that is really important when new business opportunities comes along. So what is a voucher? Because I know that in our domain, we know what a voucher is, the ones of us in IT and our business knows it, but when you go outside our domain, a voucher is kind of a discount you get or something like that. And it's not what we are talking about here. We are sending, as the accounting bonded contexts are sending detailed transaction to SAP. And a detailed transaction has kind of an amount that should go in or out, debit or credit, on an account in SAP related to the correct SAP company. So that is the one thing. And then, of course, there's a lot of extra information like payment method, tax code, and all those stuff. But since the solution let the user set up this by configuration, it's so easy for them to take on board the new types of business possibilities. So this was an important functionality. And we started out, as always, to look at the boundaries. And for the accounting, it was really a lot of information needs. You needed to know about the accounts, you need to know about currencies rate, and you need to know about currency source, and much more. It's black there, so I get a bit. Yeah. So there's a lot of information on the boundaries, but most of that information is owned by the accounting context itself. But still, it was important for us in the team to see this picture. And of course, what some boundaries, those boundaries is also kind of dictating what is the given part of our feature test. Meaning that when you have a lot of information needs for a calculation, the given part in the feature test become much more complicated. But in a way, it just reflects the task the user has, because when they are pushing voucher calculation button in our solution, they need to make sure that all the information we have identified on the boundary already are there. They needed to enter those currency rates and do all that stuff. But still, doing the boundaries part and focusing on this bounded context was the easy part, because then we needed to add more and more feature tests. And for this area, I guess the calculation might be much more complex than it sounds like, because we ended up with a lot of feature tests, around 500 feature tests. So driving all these requirements and understanding all these examples. But we had this calculation in our old solution, and doing that kind of in one big bang, because you had this whole calculation and you have to implement it and put it into production more or less together, was much more difficult. Here we added one feature test and the next, and since our feature test is our automatically test support, we knew when we came to the end that we actually had a solution and a calculation that was running. And for me, I call it feature-driven calculation implementation, and it feels like heaven. If I've been working in the old solution, and you know when you put the last part, everything kind of pulled together. So having this safety net for the bounded context was for us really important. But this, to making this domain model here, wasn't as easy as it was for some of our other bounded contexts. It was quite early clear that the things that we identified, the namings and the concept that we had from our feature test was not enough to do what we needed. We needed more calculation power. So we used some time on the whiteboard. We were discussing and trying to figure out and tried more different ways of doing it. And of course, it wasn't like we do whiteboard and then we do the 500 feature test. We did some of the feature tests. We figured out we needed to do some more here. We needed more concept. And we ended up with this accounting input, a voucher calculation basis and voucher calculation basis line. And for the accounting input, for instance, I felt a bit, I had to take some thinking, okay, are we doing really DDD? Is this our users' language? And then, because if I visit our users, they are talking about invoice and voucher and accounting template all the time, but they don't wandering in the hallways and say, oh, this is accounting input. But they were telling us scenarios like, okay, in this or this case, you should take the quantity from the invoice and use that as input to your voucher calculation. And I said, in this and these cases, you should not take the quantity from the invoice and use it in your voucher calculation. So they had this concept of accounting input, but it wasn't that clearly visible when I was thinking about the mental model. And when it comes to the voucher calculation basis and the voucher calculation basis lines, that was more concept that, well, if I go back to the designer mental model for the UX area, it was concept that I can tell them about, and I think they will understand it. I haven't done that because this was the reflection I did after the project was ended, but I know them well, so I know they are discussing this voucher calculation, so I think the voucher calculation basis would have made sense for them. So that was kind of the guiding star here, that we needed some words or some concept that at least make sense related to how the users are thinking. So it was a harder domain model to make. Of course, it was a much more complex domain, a business domain to implement too. But I think, as I said, that some of the concept we used was more invisible in the user mental model, and then you have to strive for it more. But it actually turned out to be a very useful mental model. And that was, so it was harder, but more fun, and at least when it was useful, it was really fun. So, but this accounting bonnet context, I think if there is one bonnet context of all we have from this 3 years long project that I'm really kind of attached to, it's the accounting bonnet context. And I know you are not supposed to be attached to have feelings for your bonnet context, but to be a bit more attached to one, because on the one side, he has shown me the great power of doing it this way, to work what I call the DDD way, but it has also given me much more resistance, that given me learning, for instance, related to those more invisible concepts. And then we had another learning too, because it was, well, that was related to the aggregates. Okay, in DDD we are talking about these aggregates. And what we do by our feature test, in our given, we had this given template line has this, and it kind of told us how we wanted to implement our accounting template aggregate, which was really important for our users. And we ended up something like this, that you have a template, it has an ID or a name that was meaningful for the users, and it has a set of lines, and it can have kind of many lines, more than 10. And it has, for instance, an SAP company, and then it has the currency and the unit. And there's a difference when you are thinking about aggregate and aggregate design. It's a really difference if you have only the SAP company ID in this aggregate pointing to another aggregate containing the SAP company information, like the currency or unit, or if you put it as part of the aggregate. And what we did was that we put it as part of the aggregate, and we knew that this was really one of the reasons why this domain model felt so really useful, because it had been so easy to solve the problem of the voucher calculation. But then, and up till then, we had used the accounting template from the old solution, so we hadn't made any CRUD-based or maintenance of this screen where the user can enter this information. So we did. And then I said, okay, when we are updating an SAP company and make another currency, that should apply to all the existing accounting templates. So what does that tell us? Well, if we take a step back, at least this is how I like to think about it. An aggregate is typical a concept that is important for the user. So in a way, it's in the user's head. And then we put it in our domain model. And so far, so good. That's 2 properties that is important. But it doesn't stop there, because this aggregate has also a technical purpose. It should be a unit of whole that we save together, we read together, and we delete together. So in this case, if we have all the SAP company information inside the aggregate, of course, not having an ID pointing out to some other information, if the user goes in another screen updating the SAP company information, it will not affect our accounting templates. So we were sitting there, wow, it's two different things. So what are we going to do? And of course, it didn't feel good to do changes because we have already done the hardcore calculation that was really important for this accounting context, that the one that we would not like to change. And we ended up to do something, don't tell anyone, it's still there. We cheated. We cheated on our way to the database because we said we can't touch this domain model. It is too good. And of course, doing this cheating didn't feel good, but to think that, okay, should we change our aggregate just to say that we do DDD right, when one of the really, really important rules of DDD is that you should make this useful domain model. And we have implemented already our calculations, so we knew that the way of thinking in the upper part, that was the useful domain model. So we ended up like this, cheating, as I said, and it wasn't good, but at least we had this useful domain model. And then I heard Eric Evans on YouTube. I was listening to old DDD videos, and I heard Eric Evans say that context is something users are so very, very good at, but the computers are not. And he said that in the keynote yesterday too, if you remember. And I was starting to think, I was thinking, wow, that is what happened here. It's really two different settings for our users, so it's two different contexts. But we didn't see that, so why didn't we see that? We had seen all these courses with the bonded context order, e-commerce examples. But I think it was because it was the same users, it was the same concepts, and more important, the only reason why an accounting template exists is because we are going to use it in our calculation. So that actually was two different contexts. We didn't get that. But if we had listened to our users' mental model, well, maybe we would have got it. And if I should have done it again, I would have removed the cheating part, split it in two bonded contexts, and we would have been there. And the solution was kind of in front of our eyes, but we didn't look that way. But as I said, the accounting bonded context did not just give me resistance. It also showed me, it gave me an experience I just have to share with you because it was so great to experience it. Because it happens that this scenario will calculate the voucher for an invoice. It was one scenario, but it is three scenarios this accounting context do. The second one is that we have something we call a financial basis. That is an aggregation of a lot of invoices or a lot of forecast invoices that is also done for doing the accounting part. And with that, a set of new rules were coming along. And those rules needed to be part of the same calculation because our user has said that, okay, at the time when you implemented it, the invoice voucher calculation just use a subset, but that might change in the future. It should be the same. So that was scenario 2. And then we have these split lines we were discussing, the split of the invoice, and that should also be accounted. So what we did was that we started out with this first calculation for the voucher. And we put it into production, and we have made it without thinking about the two others. So not because we didn't know about them. We knew they were coming around the corner, but at the same time, we had enough in our minds to make the first one to be good. So when we were going to put in the second calculation of this financial basis, I was wondering, okay, we have actually modeled the domain based on the business. So will the new scenario fit in? It felt like we're living in magic. But what happens really was that the second scenario, it just came and it was so smoothly. It was like it fit into that domain model. It was like the domain model was sitting there waiting for the new requirements. And I have never experienced something like that when I've been working the old way. And then the third scenario came, and the same experience was there. It was like, it was just waiting. Of course, we needed to add new feature tests. We needed to do some enhancement of the model, but the shape of it, it was just waiting for the new requirements. And it was so amazing to experience that. And if I take us back to where we started with this designer model, when we have a designer model and we have a user interface based on that, we try to seek to give the model resistant. And we often do that by doing usability testing, and based on that we can change our designer model. And the same is what I think we do for DDD. We give them all those scenarios, and we give it resistance, and we end up with a model that has been tested a lot. And in the future, I will use this thinking around the user's mentor model and use that to test my domain models, not instead of anything I've done up to now, but just in addition to, because I believe it gives you an extra aspect that is important to pay attention to. Because you see, what happened with the accounting bundle context that I felt was so great, I don't think it was based on luck. And I feel so confident that if we had done a more technical approach, we wouldn't have achieved this. Because what I saw during this 3 years long project, that by working this way, for us, I don't say it's the only way of working, of course not. There is always plenty options. And we had, as I said, a team knowing the business well, so that might influence it. But for us, we managed to solve the complex calculation in one bonded context after the other. So when we started the project, we thought that, okay, those calculations will be the hard stuff. Those calculations was the part that felt confident to do. So I'm so incredibly happy that I was part of this project. I'm actually quite proud of what we did, of what we managed to do. And as I said, I feel the place we are today is a good place to be. And I think there is something that is especially important for our achievement. One thing was that we view our legacy solution as valuable when we started. I use this term, not a big ball of mud, but a big ball of value. And I think that mindset and exploiting that was important for us. The second thing was the bonded context. We couldn't have done it without the bonded context, no way. So thanks to Eric Evans for that. And after his keynote talk yesterday that I find really inspiring, I want to run back to work and see of all our bonded context and reflect how it would be if we classified them the new way he was talking about the bonded context. But that's another thing. And then we have this combination of doing DDD with a feature test. It gave us the automatically test support that was so valuable for us. And it also gave us the possibility to do gradually implementation and gradually forming our domain model. And that was really, really important. So thanks to Ellen Lippe, my friend and DDD mentor, but also our tech lead, for introducing us to the power of DDD and BDD. And I recommend that highly to look into. But at least, but really important, I think it was such a joy to work in a team, knowing the business so well, and doing DDD in that context. And even though, since as I said, a lot of this is based just on my reflection, we did never talk about a user-mentor model during our project. But I honestly believe that we knew our users from working with them for years and years. The first time I worked with our user was in 1995, and I've done different things after that. But a lot of people in the team, it's not like working for 1 year, it's a lot of years, so we knew them. I think we knew them so good that we actually knew their way of thinking. And based on that, we ended up with domain models that wasn't too far from the user's mentor model. So maybe one day I will, greatly inspired by Dan Norman, make my own model focusing on minimizing the domain model mental model gap. And by that, I want to thank you all for listening, and I hope you all find the joy of modeling in your own project and with your own domains, and I hope you find the joy with or without the user's mental model in mind. Thank you.